Good morning. I want you all to know that when I packed in New York a week ago, I did not know I was going to be matching the podium. So. Yeah, I think I deserve applause for that. I agree with you. Yeah. So thank you for coming out on a Sunday morning. I don't know if I would have been as ambitious as you if I had not been actually listed on the program. I want to start thinking about being invited to a writing seminar because, and we can even go here. Okay, to make it go forward, what do I do? Oh, you turn it on. I can do that. It's only really recently, if I think about it, that I've come to terms with the identity of writer. So I want to tell you a short personal story about that journey to saying sort of, yes, I am a writer, admitting it or being proud of it or what have you. Years ago, quite a while ago, years and years ago, I accompanied my father, Milton Bass, who was a noted novelist and columnist, arts and entertainment journalist. And I accompanied him on a travel writer's jaunt. My mother couldn't go. My father was no longer driving himself anywhere. So he asked if I wanted to go. It was 3 nights of nice hotels and good food and sightseeing. And I have to say, my advice to you is if you ever get offered the job of being a travel writer, you should say yes, because it's a really good gig. And on the trip, one of the other travel writers asked me if I was a writer like really the rest of my entire family. My father, my mother, my sister, my brother are all journalists, all writers. And I said no. I said, I'm a history professor. And my father interrupted me and said, well, you kind of are. But I pushed it off. No, I wasn't. And I don't know why I denied the identity. I don't know what it means to be a writer if I wasn't one. I wrote all the time. I got kind of paid for it. Why did being a historian, someone who does indeed tell stories for a living, we've been compared to terriers because of the way we dig to ensure that no stone of information gets unturned in the pursuit of answering questions that we think are vital. Why did that preclude me from understanding myself as a writer? And that changed with my most recent book, One Goal. One Goal is the story that uses the lens of a high school soccer team and its quest for its city's first state championship title to explore the negotiations of a small, overwhelmingly white, Catholic, Quebecois Maine community that very quickly became entangled in the migration of thousands of Somali refugees. And One Goal is my 4th book, but in so many ways, in almost every way, when I reflect on its process and what has happened since, it is a first. This project started for me as an article for CNN Opinion, where I'm a frequent contributor, so it was like 900 words about this team. But within 48 hours of that piece going live, and the incredibly ugly commentary, comments, emails, phone calls, actual letters, haters have some serious sort of motivation behind them, that online scribes often endure the xenophobic, Islamophobic, really hateful stuff. An editor from one of the big 5 publishing houses reached out and asked if I had thought about writing an entire book about this soccer team that's up in Maine. And I answered very simply, I've thought of absolutely nothing else for the last 3 days. To write One Goal, I made myself a student in a lot of ways. Instead of diving into research in my usual whirlwind fashion, and that would happen eventually, I promise, reading every scrap of sports writing about this team, about this town, heading to the high school library one insufferably hot July day without air conditioning, because Maine high schools don't have air conditioning, to read every single copy of the high school yearbook from the beginning of time to present, which was something that sports writer Jeff Pearlman told me to do. And for anyone ever looking for a story, go read high school yearbooks because they're full of them. Or nagging coaches and players and families with questions about the tiniest details. All of that was going to happen. But before doing any of that, I bought every book about writing I could find. and stacked them up in my living room. It looked like I had just enrolled in an MFA program in creative writing, and started to read them. And my husband came in one night and said, "It's your 4th book. Don't you know how to do this by now?" But somewhere among reading and rereading Stephen King's On Writing or Jack Hart's Storycraft, somewhere between that and handing in the first full draft of One Goal, and then probably working on the 3rd set of page proofs, I finally sort of had embraced the ability to say, I'm a writer. And it's because of where this story took me and what it made me think about and how I came to think yet again with how powerful telling stories can be. And this story starts in many ways at the end. This is the end of the story. This is not a spoiler. You'll be okay. This is a shot taken by the intrepid journalists at the Lewiston Sun-Journal on November 7th, 2015. A day in which 4,500 people, which is the equivalent of 25,000 people at a football game in Texas, because this is Maine, sat in the bleachers of Portland's Fitzpatrick Stadium to watch the undefeated, nationally ranked Lewiston Blue Devils soccer team face the Scarborough Red Storm for the boys' Class A state championship title. On paper, the two teams were very well matched. They both had strong defenses, they had worked through the playoff games with shutouts, and they had undefeated seasons. But there was a key difference between these two teams. The Blue Devils had a starting roster in which all but one player was an African immigrant, and most of those were Somali refugees. It is, at the beginning, a sports story. The 2015 Blue Devils were what we would absolutely call a dream team. To get to this moment, on this day in November, this soccer team outscored their opponents across the season 113-7. This is soccer. So think about that for a minute, right? 113 goals. 26 of them had been scored by this young man, Abdi Sharif Hassan, who graduated with a total goal score of 68 for his high school career, a 2-time All-American, despite the fact that head coach Mike McGraw pulled him before the half in most games, trying to keep the score down in some effort of sportsmanship. So as soon as they were up by 5, which could happen in the first 20 minutes of a game, the starters sat down. The record-breaking crowd that fall, and again, there were more people at the state championship soccer game that year than attended the state championship football game a few weeks later, which is heresy in Maine. It really, this crowd, if you look at it, if you look at who's in Maine versus what we think about Maine, this crowd really exemplified the changes that had taken place in Lewiston over the last decade or so. And change was nothing new to Lewiston. It was a city that had continuously evolved, from its earliest settlements to its heyday as a thriving textile manufacturing center, to the days when the factories closed and the economy plunged and young people didn't stick around anymore. But now this city, this very still French-Canadian city of some 36,000 people, is on a road to recovery, as it has become host to some 7,000 Somali refugees. People who have been pushed out of their country by civil war, by famine, by drought, into a desperate diaspora. And the lucky ones, like Mohammed Khalid's family, found their way to the refugee camps of Africa. And I just want to read just a few paragraphs of Mo's story to give some context. Unlike some of his teammates who simply say nice, a word they use often in response to a question they don't want to answer, when asked about growing up in a refugee camp, Mohammed speaks freely, vividly, about his time in Hagadera. He remembers the day the grocery store burned down, the robberies, the daily demand to get fresh water before the well shut down during Ayasr, the third of the 5 daily prayers, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He remembers his mother, Habibo Farah, a small, shy woman he describes as the strongest person I know, walking to different houses at night, searching for leftovers his family could have for dinner. He remembers the nights with no dinner at all. His father wasn't around much, there was little money, and hunger threatened constantly. When he was just 3 years old, he saw one of his best friends digging through his own excrement to find something, anything, to eat. Looking for a place where they could lay the foundations that would enable their children to get an education and to get a chance. And Mo's mother actually had to make the devastating choice to take her 3 younger children to America with her and leave her 2 older daughters behind because they didn't make the cut. So making these choices, these people found Lewiston in what we call a secondary migration, which means they were officially relocated somewhere else. And for the Somali families in Lewiston, that tended to be the outskirts of Atlanta, which has an enormous refugee population. And then they moved to Lewiston as word of mouth began to spread about the city's safety, its vacancy, its affordability, and its good schools. And it was a factory town. It was not necessarily what I would call a smooth transition. Within a year or so of the first families arriving, the city's mayor wrote an open letter asking them to tell their relatives and their friends to stop coming, that the city was at capacity. And a few years later, a man threw a frozen pig's head into the downtown mosque during evening prayers, something that Liz Strout has fictionalized in her beautiful book, The Burgess Boys. A national white supremacist group threatened and made good on their promise to visit the city. But in more ways than not, today Lewiston is a cautious example of a refugee community successfully integrating and negotiating with its chosen landing place. And when you walk through the streets of this once Quebecois town, it's a global experience, which is a critical facet to how this once pretty downtrodden place, the poorest neighborhoods in Maine, are in Lewiston. It has learned to carve out a better future. So I want to read just a little bit of a description of what it's like to walk through the center of Lewiston today. On Lincoln Street, across from the vast Bates Mill complex, sits Labady's Bakery, a Lewiston institution since 1925. Old people come in, says the girl behind a counter filled with an extraordinary arrangement of donuts, pastries, and whoopie pies. Whoopie pies are Maine's official state snack, so I highly recommend doing research in Maine. I used to live over there, they'll say. She points to the multi-level parking garage that the bakery faces, where tenements constructed for factory workers once stood. The garage supports the urban renewal projects of the mill complex, the restaurants, brewery, and small businesses filling the massive red brick buildings that once housed a significant portion of America's textile industry. Next door to the bakery, a shuttered halal grocery represents someone's vanquished business dream, a for rent sign in the dirty window. But a few blocks over on Lisbon Street, similar entrepreneurial endeavors thrive, indicative of the transformations in Maine's second largest city. Today, the Somalis see themselves as very much a part of Lewiston's recovering economy. They want to stay, one longtime Lewiston resident tells me. Unlike a lot of people, they want to be here. A storefront mosque discreetly occupies space beside stores selling Somali food and clothing, vibrant hijab and chador and kimars hanging in shop windows next to soccer jerseys. The Islamic Center, a nondescript 3-story row house with entrances on both Lisbon and Canal Streets, is packed on Fridays for midday prayer. Women pray in the basement while men fill the upper levels. On weekends, there is dugzi, Quran study for children. The greatest concentration of Somali businesses on Lisbon sits between Chestnut and Pine: Banadir Cafe, Daye Store, Al Medina Variety and Halal, Maskali Cafe, and El Fatah Variety. While clan identification lost much of its meaning in Lewiston, people often shop along clan lines, making for a crowded marketplace. Most of the customers on Lisbon Street are Somali, although some hail from Congo, Sudan, Uganda, and Angola. All are welcome. Assalamu alaikum. That's just good business. The stores offer a variety of goods and services, including wire transfers to send money to relatives still in Africa. Advertisements for phone cards and Boost Mobile are everywhere. Like a Mobile, $29 a month, 3 hours to Somalia. Photographs of Somali delicacies like sambusa, line store windows, while inside spices, teas, and mixes for guava and mango juice sit on shelves next to boxes of chop-away plantain fufu flour, bags of Maggi seasoning cubes, jars of egusi, and bottles of Praise African red palm oil, perfect for stewing goat. 40-pound bags of rice are everywhere. Some families go through 2 per month. Boxes of halal meat, camel, chicken, goat, beef, are stored in coolers or freezers labeled in Arabic. Bananas, a staple of Somali cuisine, are offered on the green side, considered better to cook with meat and slice into rice. One of the most successful stores on the street is the Mogadishu Store, owned and run by Mama Shukri Abashek. Her family lost its home and business when violence escalated in Somalia in the late 1980s. Almost a decade in Dadaab, she arrived in Atlanta in 1999, but hated big city life. In 2002, she moved to Lewiston. 4 years later, she opened the store, many of her 8 children helping her. Her sign promises much. Grocery store, restaurant, money transmitter, seamstress, tax preparer, halal meat, and cleaning services. Inside the large space, divided by a row of locker freezers, there is little a customer can't find, from colorful scarves hanging in the back to the hot food resting on small heating units. Out in front, women pile their plastic bags of goods together on spreads of colorful fabric, tying it together to loop around their heads and carry back home. Petite Canada is now Little Mogadishu. Within all of this, the high school soccer team, in no small way, played a role in how these changes took place. Because, as I write in the introduction of One Goal, soccer is how these kids live where they landed. My book, One Goal, is the story of the Lewiston Blue Devils. It is about the art of soccer that these kids play. It is how these players and their families, these coaches and teachers and community leaders do the work to create community. It's about why sport matters. It's about how to make meaning out of sport and where it fits into the threads of our daily lives and what we can learn from it. And this is actually one of my favorite photos that I shot for One Goal, in which we have a soccer game going on in the summer, and you have this juxtaposition of the players who have been given their shirts by Subway, by a local business owner who supports the team. You have their mothers and sisters who are using the moment of the soccer game to take a break from work and catch up and gossip. Summer games are free, so they tend to have a pretty high attendance. And then in the back, you have the landscape of the Androscoggin Colisée, the hockey arena, which is the most important building in town because it's the hockey arena, and this is Maine. And so thinking about making space in this hockey town for these kinds of things to happen, in which Lewiston now has this problem that there's not enough green space for the soccer that it wants to field. Under the guidance of longtime coach Mike McGraw, Lewiston born, Lewiston educated, Lewiston forever. These kids, both newcomers and longtime Mainers alike, look to do what no one had done before them: bring home a state championship soccer trophy. That's what this story is about at the end of the day. But for me, what was important was that everyone had taken a different path to get to that stadium that day in November. And for those precious game minutes in that state final, most of which saw the Red Storm and the Blue Devils holding each other to 0-0 play, those thousands of fans had one thing in common. They all, as Lewiston High School's motto tells us, were bleeding blue. In the book, I describe the moment through Shobo Saban, who was one of the first Somali players to come onto the varsity soccer roster at Lewiston. So I'm going to speak from Shobo's voice here. These were Lewiston fans, Shobo thought. He flashed back to when his family had first arrived in Lewiston, the days when people told him to leave. His mother told him then to have a big heart, to have empathy. When you love others, she said, sincerely love them, you will eventually get it back. Looking at the crowd of Blue Devils fans, black, white, Muslim, Catholic, Somali, Franco, Shobo realized that his mother was right. While his community wasn't perfect, it was better. He felt the stereotypes, terrorist, drug dealer, pirate, that had plagued him just a few years ago begin to disappear. Here, he thought, looking at the field, he was a proud Lewiston soccer player. It was, he would later say, a we moment. with soccer creating the space, at least for those few hours, for them to come together as a community, as Blue Devils, bleeding blue, looking for that one goal. But a lot of work goes into a wee moment. And one goal, again, is about all of the journeys that had to happen to make that day happen. Some of those journeys started in Quebec, some of those journeys started in Somalia, and still others started right there in the neighborhoods of Lewiston for generations upon generations. But all of them were trying, as described to me by my friend Abdi Kadir Negi, who's one of the elders in the Somali community. He's a community leader. He's someone who spent 14 years in Dadaab as a boy, waiting for something to happen that got him out. And he said that what they were looking for was to simply have welcome, to find a home, and then once they were there, to make it work. But a lot of changes had to happen. A lot of work had to happen. Coach McGraw had to change the very way he coached, everything about it. He had to understand what it meant to field a team of players in the hot summer sun during Ramadan who hadn't eaten or had any water since 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He had to understand why a player might legitimately miss practice because you never say no to your parents. And if your parents say you need to take your mother to the doctor and translate for her, there is only one answer to that charge to do. And that these kids didn't even play the kind of soccer that Lewiston had played. They didn't play kick and chase soccer. And so if you're not a soccer aficionado, kick and chase soccer, if you've ever seen a youth soccer game, that's kick and chase soccer. One kid kicks the ball, they all run to it as fast as they can. The first one who gets there then gets to kick the ball, and they move the ball downfield until the other team takes it away and does the same thing. That's not what these kids did. These were kids who had a ball at their feet every second they were allowed to have a ball at their feet. They played the much more sophisticated possession game, a patient game that relies on passing in every direction and teamwork, 1 or 2 touches to a player. The school had to change the way it taught. They had to accommodate new languages. They had to accommodate new customs, new holidays, new rhythms. They had to label pork, which is haram or forbidden in Islam, clearly in the cafeteria. The athletic director had to change the way he managed his programs, utilizing a whole network of community volunteers to explain things that might be considered simple, like signing a permission slip or getting the required physical. He also made the interesting decision to hire the young man in the blue shirt, Abdi Jabbar Hirsi, who's the school's first Somali coach and the son of the gentleman on the left, Abdullahi Abdi, who the community calls the coach of everyone, who coaches youth games, volunteer leagues, recreational leagues on a daily basis. These folks helped ensure that best practices happen not just on the field, but off the field, and gave Lewiston an enormous strategic advantage in that they could call out plays in both Arabic and Somali. Teammates had to change the way they looked at one another. They had to think consciously of how to make a teammate a friend. And families had to learn how to be neighbors, as Somalis settled into homes right next door in the apartment buildings, in the apartment houses, with multi-generational Mainers. The players understood what was at stake as much as everyone, which you can see by taking a look at the team shirt from that historic 2015 season. And this was a shirt that was created via text messaging, which, thank goodness, kids don't erase anything on their phones, because I got to use all of their text messages for the book. And it was a text exchange between these two. Abdi Sharif Hassan, born in Dadaab refugee camp to Somali parents, and Austin Wing, whose French-Canadian heritage exemplifies much of Lewiston's immigration history until very recently. And it was they who came up with the idea of unity. The two captains, one the greatest goalie in history, did this to understand who they were and what they wanted to be as they settled upon this goal to win this championship, going into this season knowing that this was what they had to do, to consciously think about what it means on really any field, but especially perhaps this one, to be one team. It means a lot in Lewiston. In Lewiston, it means that kids from different countries who speak different languages and observe different religions can come together and win. And it means more because in Lewiston, they will tell you to a person, soccer is life. This isn't a team that just tolerated difference. They embraced it. They capitalized on it. The meteoric rise of the Lewiston Blue Devils to the top ranks of U.S. high school soccer, I write in the introduction, shows in so many ways what happens when America works the way it's supposed to, the way it reads on paper. The Blue Devils made this improbable championship run in one of the whitest states in America, in a city that hadn't talked about hope for a very long time. There are some 60 million displaced peoples in this world, people without a place to call home. And this is a story about a handful who found one. Lewiston's relationship with these players has ebbed and flowed. It is a story of painful rupture, and it is a story with joyful and meaningful coming-togethers. But it is, again, perhaps most simply, a story of a championship hockey town that made room for soccer. And it is about people who accomplished the one thing that for a long time had felt impossible, bringing a trophy home. And when they did that, this is where they went. The players climbed the bleachers to celebrate with the community that they knew had been so much a part of this. And it's now actually against the rules to do this in Maine because of this moment, so this is the last time that anyone climbed into the bleachers after winning a soccer championship. So one goal, I think, is an adrenaline-charged sports story, but I think it's more than that. I think it's about how and why we need to take a moment to think about what we can do when we do it together. And years ago, Coach Mike McGraw asked a few of the Somali newcomers how they would say the words that he says more than any other. If you stand on the sidelines with this man, as I have for uncountable hours, anytime he sends them to the field, he yells, "Together, together." And he asked them, he said, "How would you say it?" And this is what they replied. They replied in Swahili, which is sort of the common denominator language of the refugee camps. And they said, "Pamoja Ndugu," which means brothers together. It's this motto that they cry before they take the field. They count 1, 2, 3, and hands go in, and they yell as one, no matter who they are or what they look like. Pamoja Ndugu. And it's that kind of phrase, it's that kind of feeling that really laid the foundation for this team as it prepared for the game of their lives on that day in November of 2015, facing the Red Storm. And it's a good motto, but it's more than that. Again, it's about how to live where we land. I once asked Shobo why he returned to Lewiston after he graduated from college. Shobo went to Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts. He majored in biology. He was pre-med. But then he came back to Lewiston. He could have gone anywhere, I said to him. Why did you come back to live? And this is probably the conversation that had the biggest impact on me working on this book. He answered with Wa Mahatsun Tahai. You just had your Swahili lesson. This is your Somali lesson. He told me that returning home was his Wa Mahatsun Tahai. It was his thank you. It was better, he told me, to thank people through your actions instead of through your words. And that's something that I write about a lot in One Goal. So I'm just gonna quote him on that. And here he's talking about the importance of public school education and supporting it in his community. I came here as an immigrant, he says, so the taxpayers who don't even know me, and I never met them, who actually spend money on me to get textbooks, to make sure the teachers get paid, to make sure that I sit in a chair. For all that, I say thank you, he says. I mean, I've never met them, I've never seen them. So that's the reason I say thank you to this community. I live my thank you. I live my Wa Mahatsun Tahai. Coming together, of course, doesn't always mean staying together. There's steps forward and there's steps back. But when you think about those 4,500 people watching that one game, those numbers mean it's not just the parents of players or maybe a next door neighbor or a friend. It was someone from everyone. It was a coming together of all those people. And while a championship soccer season isn't going to fix everything, it did bring this community together for that one game, and maybe even for that entire season. It let them find their one amidst their many, and it let them find their we in the midst of a world that is almost always us versus them. And so now when they do lose it, when they do have those fractures, they know what it feels like. And so in those moments when they might pull apart, they know what they're supposed to be looking for when they get it back. So with that, I thank you and would love to take a few questions if we have time.
Please stand to ask your question and wait for the microphone to come to you.
So, did any go on to play soccer in college of any note?
Yes, so Abdi Sharif Hassan just finished his junior year at UMass Lowell, Division I Riverhawks, and was captain this year as a junior and will return as a captain and is one of the team student-athlete leaders because of his GPA. Bilal Hersey, who will graduate this spring, is going to Division I Siena. So those are two enormous soccer success stories, student success stories. Many, many, many of them go on to play in the local community college and in the main state systems, because one of the things that these families want to do is stay together. These are families that have worked so hard and have sacrificed so much to be together, that now that they don't always want to go very far away.
One upstairs.
Hi, I'm wondering if any of the Somali girls play soccer. I'm guessing probably not. I'm wondering if you saw any sign that in the future families might allow that as they became more Americanized.
Yes, so it's not a story of Americanization in a lot of ways. It's a story, they use the word integration, and I always use the word negotiation because there's give and take on all sides. So in Somalia, soccer is not normally played by girls, and I always sort of liken it to field hockey in the United States, that the culture of field hockey in the United States is very female-oriented, and in Somalia, the culture of soccer is very male-oriented. It doesn't mean that the Somali girls aren't athletes. So in the book, I talk about where they do excel and where they are shattering state records left and right, and that's in track and field primarily, both in the jumping and running events. And that doesn't just mean the high school. The youth rec league of Lewiston's relays have broken every record in Maine history at this point. And they could go 15 girls deep if they wanted to. So girls are athletes. You will see them at halftime of a rec game, maybe kick a ball around or whatever. They know the game cold. I mean, they can talk to you about soccer for days, but they tend to be found on the track or on the cross-country trails.
I have a question down in the front here.
Hi. So we've been talking a lot this weekend about bad parenting and exploitation and those kinds of things. Could you talk a little bit more about the coach of this team and his role and how this all came together?
So Mike McGraw is about a month and a half ago retired. So the team's about to go into transition in terms of coaching. Mike was in his 4th decade of coaching this team when they won. And so he would always say, I don't need a state championship, but I really want a state championship. So his goal was always what I call in the book the advantage of the ball, that you put the game first and that everything else would follow. But there's a scene in the book, and it's actually excerpted in your program, where there is a turning point where he does sort of have to go old school coach to get them to physically hang out together and then see what would happen. But that this is a story about soccer isn't an accident. Soccer is a game of continuity. It is not a game of fracture when it's played as it should be played, when it's the beautiful game. And to do that, it means that you have to move a ball across an enormous field of space, passing it without even looking at each other. And that's one of the things that you notice when you watch Lewiston soccer. They're always looking at each other. They're never looking at the ball. And so to create those kind of bonds and to create that kind of relationship amongst the team, he wasn't trying to save the world. He was trying to win a trophy. But he might be saving a little bit of part of the world too. And the other piece of that is the relationships with people like Coach Abdi and Abdi Jabbar Hersey and bringing in that community piece. because that's how you create relationships. You know, the boosters understood completely that the Somali parents weren't going to be able to like staff the snack stand because they are working 24/7, 2, 3, 4 jobs. But you know, if we bring groceries over to your house, would you make sambusa and contribute them to the snack shack? I write a lot about snacks in the book. Because the snack shack really showed who was in the stands and who was on the field. What is the top seller? It's not hot dogs in Lewiston, it's sambusa, which you should try. They're little doughy pastry, yummy things. So those are the kinds of little tiny pieces, I think, that make the whole.
What was the percentage of blacks and whites on the team, and how did the whites do in the championship game?
So I don't have white stats for the championship game. You know, the Austin Wing is a captain. He is the only white kid on the starting roster on the 2015 team. And so one of the things that we've seen over time, and Abdullahi Abdi coaches the 8th grade team, the middle school team, and he is the voice of wonder on this. One of the things that happened that tipped the balance to immigrants, to recent immigrants, during this period of time is that these were kids who put soccer first. And the soccer team in Lewiston for a very long time had been the way that hockey players stayed in shape through the fall for their real sport. And then some basketball players too. And so one of the things that happens is for the very first time, Mike McGraw has kids on his team who put soccer first. So suddenly you couldn't just walk on to the soccer team and grab your varsity letter. You had to try out, and there was a heck of a chance you weren't gonna make it. That has now made soccer far more serious in Lewiston. And so we begin to see a little bit more of a socioeconomic racial balance on the team because now you have the full community doing the work that it takes to be on the varsity roster of this team. So from 2015 to now, those demographics have changed mightily on that roster because if you want to play soccer, it's a marquee sport and you got to work for it.
Thank you for your story. I'm a boyhood Mainer, and so in one way, this is really great. I want to take you back to where you started, which was, can you talk about this book as a work of narrative nonfiction versus what it might have been if you had approached it as a historian?
I think the biggest difference is people read it. Including my husband, who's never read anything I've written before. He's still on page 16 of my first book, which he doesn't think I know, but I can tell. I took, like I said, it's not an accident that I bought books on writing. It's not an accident. I felt so, when my husband said to me where I started, it's your 4th book, what are you doing? I felt so intimidated, humbled, honored, freaked out that these people were trusting me with their story. And, when I started this book, think about the naive days of 2015, right? It wasn't like a crazy time to be writing an immigrant story in the United States. And then, right before the book came out, it became a really big deal. So when those first executive orders came out that were the Muslim bans came out, Somalia is one of the targeted countries on that list. The shitholes speech was made, which I wrote about right before the book came out. It just became really increasingly important to me that I wrote this book in a way that as many people as possible would be able to digest it. And it's bittersweet for me in a lot of ways just how relevant this story has become. Like, I wish it didn't matter this much. But one of the things that has been so incredibly rewarding is how many high schools and middle schools and colleges have, taken on the book. And that surprised us, and it shouldn't have, because, I'm someone who writes about the mega event, the World Cup, the Olympics, and now I'm writing about a high school team. But I think that in so many ways, this isn't just an American story, it's a very important American story. And it's a way of understanding what people are doing to live side by side in the most complicated situation you can imagine. So I took the writing in terms of accessibility and also in terms of making people understand a version of Maine that has nothing to do with blueberry pie, sailboats, or the Bush family.
We have a question up in the balcony.
Hi, I was really curious about going into a hockey town, which is a sport obviously with a lot of barriers, with a lot of economic barriers. You have to have all kinds of gear and blah, and with soccer, obviously all you need is a ball and some space. And the culture of hockey was and is extremely white and extremely privileged. I'm curious about whether you saw that culture in Lewiston starting to change at all, whether that sport is being affected by what's going on in soccer.
You know, it could have gone really badly. And you describe hockey beautifully. And the backup goalie for the 2015 season, Alex Rivet, is now actually a semi-professional hockey player. He's a hockey rock star. And he's also a great goalie. He just, you know, he was on this at the same point as Austin was, who's an amazing goalie. The barrier thing is interesting because you can put barriers up for soccer. You can put a fence around a field, which Lewiston tried and then discovered that was really stupid because they were going to climb the fence. You can charge admission to a soccer game, which they do, which means the parents just don't go until the second half when the ticket booth closes. But I think that one of the juxtapositions of soccer in Lewiston that's teaching Lewiston a different idea about sport, and it's actually one of my very favorite parts of the book, is as I increasingly got access into these communities, I would go to like the pickup games. I would get a text that would say like, hey, we're going down to the river. And I knew what that meant because every night they marched down to the river. And that's where the actual game takes place, right? High school games are almost, you know, the sidebar to the game in which you have 40, 50 guys per side. There's no positions, there's no lines, there's no goals. It's madness. And McGraw will sometimes go and sort of sit on the side and hide himself and watch and just keep his fingers crossed the entire time that no one dies. So I think that idea of sport taking up free space is something that Lewiston had to get used to. And in fact, I spent a lot of time in City Hall talking to people that are in charge of the free space of Lewiston. They don't have enough room for soccer. And they didn't know what you had to do to, you know, maintain grass in a soccer town where your public parks were suddenly having balls kicked on them. But that's one of the beautiful things about soccer, and that's why it is a sport that comes out of the refugee camps, where they didn't even have balls, they made their own, right? They just wadded stuff up that you could kick. They hate shin guards. They hate mouth guards. They think that these are the things they hate shoes. They think that these are the things that ruin the game. So you see sort of the formal versus the informal. And the high school version of the game is the most contained version, the most disciplined version, but that's been really useful in terms of getting yourself through high school, getting yourself through that next step, supporting your family, and so on. So there's a good balance, I think, that comes out of that. Thank you.
Time for one more.
The book, it seems to me, the book, it seems to me, is a story not only about soccer, but even more a story of education. And I was hoping that you'd share with everyone the kinds of things that Mike McGraw, as a chemistry teacher at the high school, as well as a coach, and the school administrators, and some of the community leaders did in order to help the formal education of these kids happen.
Sure, the education piece of this book, which it shouldn't because I'm a professor, but it took me by surprise. I didn't know I was going to be thinking about education as much as I did, but really the schools were on the front lines when it's from what I can tell, the fastest transition of demographic in modern American history in terms of this scale. 7,000 refugees descending upon a city of about 36,000 people inside of a decade. So the schools, there was the obvious, there was language, right? English language learning, to create those kinds of classes, to create networks that didn't rely upon literacy. At first they were translating things into Somali to send home notices, and then realized that Somali culture is often an oral culture and that this was a low literacy community within their own language. And so then old-fashioned phone trees, had to be developed. thinking about every piece of minutia, custom, again, thinking about what was being served in the cafeteria, thinking about the accommodations for Ramadan and what have you. And athletic practices during Ramadan had to really be thought of. It does, the scheduling of that is something to think about. But I think that one of the biggest things to crow about in terms of the changes that the education folks make and do and put into place is that the graduation rate at the high school went up for everybody when these accommodations were made. That longtime Mainers who now don't graduate at quite the rate that the newcomers do. Somalis have a higher graduation rate than longtime Mainers. But poverty creates achievement gaps. And Lewiston was a town of poverty. And so tardiness, absenteeism, these were the things that plagued this school. And when they put in accommodations to accommodate the newcomers, everyone did better. And everyone is doing better. So I think that the education piece surprised me, and it shouldn't have, but they were absolutely the front lines. All right, thank you so much.